So, how does chi stagnation show up? Well, chronically, it manifests as depression, anxiety, irritability. I saw a great release of it the other day on my acupuncture table. Somebody just laid down and literally was like, started crying. I mean, that can even be a movement of chi.
Welcome to the Resiliency Method, the truth about healing. I'm Dr. Erika, and we are here to uncover the root causes keeping you stuck. Together, we'll restore your energy, your focus, and your resiliency so you can finally heal, regenerate, and feel truly alive again.
What if everything that you have been told about chronic illness is only half the story? What if the fatigue, the inflammation, the brain fog, the symptoms that keep coming back, no matter what you try, aren't really random? And what if aging isn't just a process of accumulated years and birthdays? What if they're a pattern, an ancient, readable, reversible pattern that your body has been trying to show you all along? Well, I'm Dr. Erika Schultz. I'm an acupuncturist, functional medicine practitioner, and the founder of the Resiliency Method. For over 15 years, I have been bridging the intelligence of traditional Chinese medicine, ancient medicine, with the most advanced tools of modern longevity science. And what I've found changes everything because your body is not broken, it is not failing you, it is speaking to you. And once you learn the language, healing and aging well becomes possible in ways that symptom management never allowed. On this podcast, we go upstream. We talk about root causes, not diagnoses. We talk about patterns, not prescriptions, not magic supplements or biohacks. We talk about what actually looks like to heal completely, age well, and to build a body that's as resilient as you are. So, welcome. Let's begin. What does Western medicine do exceptionally well? Acute care, emergencies, infections, trauma. Man, if you break your leg or you need emergency surgery, Western medicine is extraordinary. When it comes to chronic illness, the stuff that, doesn't go away, we tend to hit a wall. And the reason is this: Western medicine is fundamentally a symptom treatment model. If you have high blood pressure, here's a medication to lower it. You have depression, here's an antidepressant. You have autoimmune flares, well, here's an immunosuppressant. Now, I'm not saying those interventions are never necessary, but notice what's missing. Nobody is really asking why you have high blood pressure. Why is your immune system attacking your own tissue? Why is your nervous system dysregulated? And the implicit assumption in the symptom treatment model is that each disease is its own separate problem requiring its own specific drug or protocol. Rheumatoid arthritis needs one thing, IBS needs another, anxiety, something else, something completely different. And I'll say too that that's not just the Western model. That's oftentimes the way we're treating it in natural medicine too. We're looking at ways to manage symptoms, albeit not without a pharmaceutical, chemical, petroleum based product, but actually through, supplements. But a lot of it are still really just managing symptoms. But what if it's wrong? What if many of these conditions, they share the same underlying patterns and we're just seeing different expressions of the same root imbalances? So here's what makes this more than just a philosophical point. Modern longevity science has identified what researchers call the 12 hallmarks of aging, 12 distinct biological mechanisms through which the body deteriorates over time. So things like DNA damage, mitochondrial dysfunction, the accumulation of senescent cells or zombie cells, chronic inflammation, and the loss of cellular communication. And what researchers are discovering is that these hallmarks aren't really independent. They actually feed each other They cluster together, they share root causes. Now, that's exactly what traditional Chinese medicine has been saying for over 3,000 years. And many of you know, if you've been listening to my podcast or you're a patient or becoming a patient, you know that that is my doctoral level of training is in that medicine. And the three patterns that I'm going to describe to you today will actually map directly onto those biological mechanisms. So this isn't coincidence. This is just two very different knowledge systems that are arriving at the same truth, but from different directions. Segment 2, introducing TCM pattern recognition. Now, in Western medicine, we diagnose by naming a disease. And in traditional Chinese medicine, or we call it TCM, we diagnose by identifying a pattern. And this is a subtle but profound distinction. A pattern isn't just kind of what's wrong with this organ, it's a description of how energy, blood, and fluids are moving inside the body, or failing to move, quite frankly the entire body. And it's not really a diagnosis. So let's briefly talk about the difference between a pattern differentiation and a diagnosis. Now, a diagnosis is a description of location and status. So a diagnosis also will align to a drug or a medical procedure. And it really doesn't inform or treat based on root cause. It's just a description, it's a label. So, for example, a diagnosis for chronic issues often ends in the word itis, or the ending itis. And itis in Latin, which is where a lot of our medical terminology comes from, is inflammation. That means inflammation and nothing more. So, if you have colitis, you have inflammation in your colon. If you have esophagitis, you have inflammation in your esophagus. You have cystitis, you have inflammation in your bladder, and so on. It's not an answer. It's not a cure. It's a descriptor. It's simply a descriptor designed to line up to a medical procedure or a drug. But sometimes people get that label, and it's almost as if they're kind of duped into thinking that now their problem is solved, right? But that's really just the beginning. Now, a pattern differentiation is more informative, but it still isn't really a root cause either. But it does inform us a bit more about what the body is doing in the face of that root cause issue. So here's an analogy I love. Think about a river. The river represents your body's vitality, your energy, your circulation, your metabolic processes. Now, when the river flows freely, the whole ecosystem along its banks is healthy. But what happens when the river gets blocked or debris accumulates or there's a storm? Well, when the water becomes stagnant, you really want to start to see these problems downstream. Plants die, animals leave, the whole environment starts to change and deteriorates. And here's the key you can't fix the downstream problems by clearing them one at a time. You actually have to go upstream and remove the blockage. Well, TCM is fundamentally upstream medicine. It asks, where is the flow disrupted and why? And what do we need to restore it? Now, there are many TCM patterns that practitioners work with, but in my clinical experience, nearly every patient with a chronic condition, no, I'm going to say every patient with a pulse, let's put it that way, every person with a pulse and is experiencing really acceleration aging, regardless if you have actual symptom picture and diagnosed with a chronic illness. But with this, you present with some combination of these three foundational patterns. So let's get into each one of them. Pattern number 1, chi stagnation. Now, the first pattern is chi stagnation. Now, if you're new to TCM, chi, pronounced like Chee, chi, is often translated as life force energy or simply as the body's vital energy. Okay. So think of it as the animating force that kind of keeps everything moving, flowing, and functioning. Now, in modern terms, we might approximate it as the combined function of your nervous system, your hormonal signaling, and your cellular energy production. Chi stagnation means this energy has gotten blocked and it's not flowing freely through the body's meridian system. And let me define what that term properly, because It's really more concrete than most people realize. Meridians are not mystical, invisible channels. They correspond to the network of vessels, arteries, and neurovascular pathways that run throughout the body. So, if you have any familiarity with Chinese medicine, you 'cause sometimes when you're first encountering it, sort of like leads you to think that you gotta like kind of come up with this whole new paradigm or way or theory of how the body works. And that's really not true. And acupuncture points, the specific locations that we needle, are what modern research actually increasingly recognizes as neurovascular nodes, which is a fancy way of saying, hey, there's a lot of electricity there, there's a lot of nerve endings there, there's a lot more activity that's more concentrated in these sites where these nerve endings, these blood vessels, and the connective tissue kind of like intersect, their intersection points, and they communicate. And we talk about chi flowing through the meridians. We're really talking about the flow of what your body actually runs on: oxygen, glucose, vital nutrients, and nerve signaling. And as researcher Donald Kennel described it, the true concept of Chinese medicine really is that it operates under known physiological principles involving the complex organization of the neural, the vascular, the endocrine, and the somatic systems. So when we say chi is stagnant, we really mean in modern language is that this flow, this coordinated communication between your nervous system and each of your vascular systems and your cellular metabolism, your organs, well, it's been disrupted. So, how does chi stagnation show up? Well, chronically, it manifests as depression, anxiety, irritability. I saw a great release of it the other day on my acupuncture table. Somebody just laid down and literally was like, started crying. I mean, that can even be a movement of chi. And acupuncture really helps facilitate, especially when you're talking about, a lot of chronic stress, built up energy. Sometimes it takes entering the room to start having that response. All right. And so this depression, anxiety, irritability, these things they show up as PMS, so premenstrual tension is a really good one, bloating, emotional volatility in many women that, experience oftentimes, and it shows up as digestive issues too. So, especially when you're talking about when you can just notice that little bit of increase in stress or that event or whatever, all of a sudden you start having gut symptoms. Man, I remember being like that like years ago before I knew anything about anything, just being, like, even at a party where you're supposed to have fun and having, like, the worst stomach ache ever. It's awful. So, anyway, if you show up as fibromyalgia, it could show up as chronic pain without a clean structural explanation, pervasive feeling of, like, being stuck physically, emotionally. And here's really the modern correlation. When we look at stress related disorders through a Western lens, we often see chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the flight or fight system, elevated cortisol, dysregulated hormones, disrupted gut motility, neuroinflammation. These are all things that are downstream consequences of what TCM calls chi stagnation. But here's where I want to push back kind of a common oversimplification. Because yes, stress, and especially emotional stress, is a major driver of chi stagnation, but it's far from the only one. And this is something that gets missed constantly in both conventional and even integrative medicine. Chi stagnation can be triggered by physical obstructions just as much as emotional ones. So let me walk through the big ones that I see clinically. Toxins is huge. Toxins in the bloodstream, toxins deeply held. These things are like heavy metals, aluminum, lead, mercury, along with pesticides and chemical exposures. Literally, these things clog the neurovascular pathways we just described. They interfere with cellular signaling. They can poison the mitochondria. They can really create a physical gridlock in the entire meridian system. And this isn't a small problem. Research actually shows that toxins like aluminum accumulate over decades in the bones, the brain, the liver, and along the nerve pathways of the body. And once they've lodged there, they actively disrupt the very cellular communication networks that, really keep chi moving and keep us healthy. The flow stops, the chi stagnates, and the aging clock tick tock accelerates. So The other thing too that can be a stagnator is stealth pathogens. And I'm talking about chronic infections that the immune system has really never fully cleared, Lyme's disease, Epstein-Barr virus, various co-infections. Well, they create an ongoing immune activation and a systemic inflammation that blocks energy flow throughout the body. And these things are called quote unquote stealth pathogens because their standard testing often misses them. Yet they are profound and under-recognized driver of chi stagnation in patients with chronic illness. And really, again, with anyone with a pulse, because, a lot of us are, I want to make note, are really waiting for us for that symptom teeter-totter to really, like, fall over before we take action on our health, and that's one of the biggest, like, misnomers, really the barriers that are getting in a lot of women's way because they're waiting for their body to break down fully before they take action beyond doing, like, diet and exercise, and I'm telling you, girlfriend, if you've got a pulse, you have these stealth pathogens hanging out and they have to be addressed because that silent aging process is working there, symptom free or not, or minimal symptom free or not. Now, another area is mycotoxins. Mold exposure is one of the most overlooked causes of cheese stagnation that I see clinically. Mycotoxins, the toxic compounds that are produced by mold, are fat soluble. So that means they can damage your brain, your nervous system. They penetrate beyond the bloodstream and they enter the blood brain barrier. They can disrupt mitochondrial energy production and they obstruct lymphatic and circulatory pathways. Now, brain fog, fatigue, chronic pain, mood dysregulation, all of these are classic chi stagnation presentations, and all are potentially rooted in mycotoxin burden. Scar tissue, that's another one. This one kind of surprises people. Physical scars, even sometimes tattoos from surgeries, injuries, C-sections, even dental procedures can actually interrupt the communication pathways running through the area of the body. So, in TCM, we actually call these interference fields. Now, a scar crossing a meridian line creates a short circuit in the energetic network that disrupts flow far beyond the local area. Now, I've seen patients with persistent systemic symptoms that trace directly back to an old surgical scar and that had really never had any therapeutic, addressing of it. And here's where this connects to the longevity in a very direct way. When mitochondria are poisoned by toxins. And when cellular energy production is disrupted, you're not just experiencing fatigue. You are accelerating the aging process at the molecular level. Are you tired of treatments, protocols, and gurus who promise results but don't deliver? You're not alone. For years, I struggled with my own long-term illness, and I know how frustrating it feels when nothing seems to work. That's why I developed the Resiliency Method. It's a science-backed approach to combining the best of Western and ancient medicines to restore your body's natural intelligence. Patient after patient has discovered what's possible, living stronger, brighter, and more spiritually connected than ever before. Whether you're facing autoimmune issues, hormonal imbalances, weight struggles, or just feeling stuck, you don't need another quick fix. You need a clear path forward. Take the first step with a discovery call at drerikaonline.com/discovery. That's DRERIKA online.com/discovery. Or dive deeper with a full initial consultation at drerikaonline.com/initial-consultation. Because your health, your clarity, and your freedom cannot wait. So mitochondrial dysfunction is one of the 12 hallmarks of aging, and it impairs your body's capacity to produce ATP, to repair DNA effectively, and to maintain cellular integrity. Chi stagnation at its root is really often a mitochondrial crisis. It's dressed in ancient language. So the point I really want to make is this. Chi stagnation is not just a stress problem, it's a flow problem. And anything that obstructs the body's neurovascular, circulatory, and energetic pathways Whether that's emotional tension, toxic burden, a chronic infection, or physical scar tissue can be the cause. And this is why the intake process in TCM looks at your environment, your exposures, your infection history, your surgical history, all of it. And because all of this tells us why the chi isn't moving, also. Okay, pattern two, blood stasis. Now, the second foundational pattern is called blood stasis. This is a stagnant, poorly circulating blood that creates tissue damage, inflammation, and dysfunction. And in TCM, healthy blood is warm, it's oxygenated, it's flowing freely. Blood stasis occurs when circulation becomes sluggish and when blood becomes thick and dark, when it pools in areas it shouldn't. Think of it as the difference between a vibrant, oxygenated stream and a dark, murky pond. And really, how does this really show up? Well, it's the pattern behind, for example, conditions like endometriosis, the tissue damage, the adhesions, the dark clotted menstrual blood. It's the fixed stabbing pain. It's the pattern behind cardiovascular disease, plaque formation, arterial stiffness, poor peripheral circulation. So think things like Raynaud, Sjogren's, even scleroderma, which is one that I've known. It's the driving pattern in autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, where chronic inflammation is really essentially destroying the body's own tissue. And it shows up as fixed pain, pain that doesn't move or that stays in one location, which is a classic blood stasis hallmark. Now, the modern correlations run deep here. So, blood stasis maps closely onto what modern medicine calls microcirculatory dysfunction. So, impaired blood flow at the capillary, those tiny, tiny little areas of your peripheral vascular system, and really is really seen prominently in peripheral vascular disease. So think diabetes, people that have chronic venous insufficiency, varicose veins. It maps into these hypercoagulable states, and it maps onto endothelial dysfunction. Now, that's a big fancy word saying really essentially where the inner lining of blood vessels and even organs lose their ability to regulate flow, and that prevents clotting and maintains vascular integrity. And here's where the longevity science becomes essential to understand. Blood stasis is directly connected to what cellular biologists call cellular senescence or zombie cells, if you've heard of that term. So essentially, this may be the most important mechanism that you need to know about linking TCM pattern theory to aging process itself. Because anytime you have a place where the body needs to keep sending new, fresh, oxygenated blood there, you have this accumulation over time of red blood cells, and that can sometimes result to having blood stasis. So senescent cells are really the cells that have stopped dividing but actually refuse to die. And they accumulate in tissues as we age, and they secrete a cocktail of inflammatory molecules called the senescence associated secretory phenotype or SASP. Things like, IL-6, TNF. These are inflammatory mediators that actually damage the surrounding tissue. And they impair immune function and actually promote further circulatory dysfunction. So, bad news bears. So, here's the feedback loop. Blood stasis will create chronic tissue hypoxia, or that just is a fancy word of saying not enough oxygen to the tissue and the areas of the body that aren't getting adequate oxygen and nutrients. That hypoxia is a major trigger for pushing cells into senescent states. So those senescent cells then release inflammatory SASP factors, which are the same cytokines that worsen blood stasis. So it's just like, perpetual, anti or engaging and re-engaging state that continues to feed off of itself, really a vicious cycle. And that damage to the endothelial cells, well, that promotes further circulatory impairment. So the cycle tightens, the blood stasis continues, causes more senescence. So senescence worsens with blood stasis. The river gets murkier. And think of that murkier river. It explains something that's really critically important about aging. It's why we develop fibrosis and scarring as we get older. Senescent fibroblasts, the cells that are responsible for connective tissue repair, for example, well, they begin with excreting excessive collagen and tissue remodeling enzymes. And this creates the tissue fibrosis, the nodules, the adhesions that show up in so many chronic conditions and so many x rays or MRIs or CT scans. And they correspond directly to the TCM description of blood stasis masses that form over time when circulation remains impaired. So, poor wound healing is another consequence. And when tissues are full of senescent cells, well, they've lost their regenerative properties and their capacity. So, injuries don't recover fully. And this process really correlates with the aches and the pains and the slow recovery that people often chalk up to just getting older, but which are really actually signs of progressive blood stasis and the cellular senescence that it drives. And then there's the cancer connection, which I want to address directly because it's clinically significant. Hopefully, I don't get, what you call it, censored for saying the C word. So, poor circulation, though, creates tissue hypoxia. Remember, hypoxia just means lack of oxygen to the area. And hypoxic conditions over time, they activate pathways that select for more aggressive cellular phenotypes. So chronic low-grade inflammation, the inflammatory process that's present in blood stasis, well, they provide growth signals for abnormal cells. And stagnant lymphatic flow will impair immune system surveillance. And this is why in TCM, cancer has long been understood as advanced expression of blood stasis patterns that have been left unresolved, and why modern oncology is increasingly recognizing that circulation optimization is part of both cancer prevention and treatment. Now, blood stasis also doesn't arise in a vacuum. So, guess what creates it most of the time? Well, a persistent, steady, good state of chi stagnation. So, when energy isn't flowing, circulation suffers. When toxins clog the neurovascular pathways, we're talking about obstructed chi patterns, and blood stagnates downstream. And this is why treating one without treating the other leads to relapse. So remember what we said. We said all of those, they gave those different examples of what stagnates chi, right? Slows down the body. And if you don't deal with those things, and especially if you're somebody that has a history of cancer and you don't go back and deal with those things that, led you to the point where your chi was stagnating and your blood was then becoming in a stasis state, then you're prone. You're going to be susceptible to relapse. It's really important for you, especially if you have a history of cancer diagnosis. Now, let's get into pattern number 3. So, pattern number 3 is phlegm dampness. So, the third foundational pattern is phlegm dampness. And this one tends to get the most, wait, what? Reactions from people that are new to TCM. And it's probably the most important one, really, truthfully. And is, I would say, one of the more overlooked patterns that a lot of healing programs, protocols are not really getting to. Now, that name sounds archaic, but when I explain it, it'll make more sense. Most people actually have an immediate, oh, that's me when I actually do describe it. So, phlegm dampness refers to the accumulation of metabolic waste, toxins, and excess fluids in the body. Now, when the body's metabolic and lymphatic processes are overwhelmed or sluggish, this dampness accumulates first in the digestive system and then throughout the entire body by creating a thick, heavy congestion that slows everything down. So, how does phlegm dampness show up? Well, weight that doesn't respond to diet and exercise. That's a good example. And what we call weight loss resistance. Brain fog, that cotton headed feeling where you can't think clearly. Chronic fatigue that isn't explained by poor sleep. Sluggish digestion, a heavy bloated feeling in the body, even before or after meals or in general. Metabolic disorders, so think like things like type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, PCOS, blood pressure issues. The modern correlations are really striking. Insulin resistance, lymphatic congestion, toxic accumulation from environmental exposures. And here's where the longevity framework is incredibly illuminating. Think about what's happening in the body when phlegm dampness is present. So, metabolic waste isn't being cleared. Toxins, heavy metals, mycotoxins, the debris of chronic infections are kind of like being stored in the fat tissue, maybe even deeply in the bones, deeply in the organs, because the body's elimination pathways are always overwhelmed. And this is not just a metaphor. This is actually research on aluminum toxicity shows us that these metals accumulate, specifically in the liver and the bones, the brain, and along the nerve pathways. And once lodged there, they actively continue to poison the cellular machinery that keeps us young and keeps us functional. So, recall those 12 hallmarks of aging. Several of them describe exactly what we're seeing in phlegm dampness. So, the failure of autophagy to work properly, that cellular trash removal system gets overwhelmed and the garbage piles up inside the cells. An altered metabolism, the body loses its ability to sense and process nutrients correctly. Gut microbiome disruption, always needing to be fixed. Pathogenic bacteria and fungi proliferate, the gut lining becomes permeable, and the toxins pour into the system circulation. And in aging, the state of chronic low grade systemic inflammation that really never resolves, that driven partly by the constant presence of metabolic waste and toxic burden. So, one thing that's absolutely critical to understand about phlegm dampness patterns in the context of aging is that your body is not failing to heal because it doesn't know how, or that you're getting older. It's failing to heal because it's too full of accumulated toxin and waste to do its job. So think of it like trying to run a detoxification program in a facility where the drainage system is already backed up. You can run all the protocols you want, the cleanses, the fasting protocols, the supplements, the strict diets. But if the underlying accumulation pattern isn't addressed, if phlegm dampness is still the dominant pattern, those efforts will produce temporary results at best. Now, this is why so many expensive detox protocols fail, not because the intention is wrong, but because they don't address the pattern. They don't improve circulation to support clearance. They don't move chi to restore the energy necessary for elimination. And they try to drain the clog without fixing the pipe. And the dampness comes right back. Segment 6. Now, I want to zoom out and connect all three patterns explicitly to what longevity researchers call accelerated biological aging, because this is where the clinical picture becomes truly sobering and truly empowering. So, modern science tells us that aging isn't just the passage of time, it's the accumulation of damage across multiple biological systems. Damaged DNA, dysfunctional mitochondria, senescent cells that won't clear, loss of stem cell regenerative capacity that's really disrupted at a cellular communication level, chronic systemic inflammation. These things now we can look at these three TCM patterns again and take a look at how they fit in here. Chi stagnation, well, it's the blocked energy flow. Mitochondrial dysfunction, it's nervous system dysregulation, it's toxic burden in the neurovascular pathways, and it directly drives DNA damage. Mitochondrial impairment and disrupted cellular signaling. Well, these are all hallmarks 1, 7, and 10 on the aging list. Blood stasis, well, that's poor circulation, tissue hypoxia, chronic inflammation, senescent cell accumulation. These are things that directly drive cellular senescence, endothelial dysfunction, fibrosis, immune deterioration, and the inflammatory cascade that ages every organ. These are hallmarks 3, 4, 8, and 11. And you can refer to our hallmarks, our 12 hallmarks guide in the show notes to get more of those clarity on the 12 hallmarks of aging. And then there's dampness, right? That toxic accumulation of metabolic dysfunction, a result of metabolic dysfunction, lymphatic congestion, or I would say it's not a result of, it's the cause of metabolic dysfunction. Let me back up because that's a huge one. Lymphatic congestion, leaky gut continuing or coming back. These things directly drive that autophagy failure, that metabolic dysregulation, that gut microbiome disruption, and the systemic inflammation of toxic burden. And these hallmarks, 5, 6, and 9, and 12. So, together, these three patterns cover all 12 hallmarks of aging, not partially, but actually comprehensively. And this means something profound. When we see a patient with multiple chronic conditions, we're not looking at bad luck or bad genetics. We're looking at a body that has been running these three unresolved patterns for years or decades. And the hallmarks of aging are the biological evidence of that. And here's the flip side, the empowering part. Addressing these patterns doesn't just treat chronic illness, it slows the aging process itself. Improving circulation isn't just about pain relief, guys. It's about clearing senescent cells and restoring tissue oxygenation. Resolving toxic accumulation, it's not just about energy. It's about restoring, getting through the day. It's about restoring mitochondria, the stem cells, and that cellular repair system that keeps your biological age young. Moving chi isn't just about mood, it's about restoring the nerves, the vascular communication that coordinates healing throughout the entire body. And this is why TCM has always been understood as medicine, not just for disease, but for longevity. The ancient Chinese emperors who lived into their 90s when the average life expectancy was 30. We're not doing that by accident. They were actively addressing these patterns. Okay, this is segment 7. Now, here's the clinical piece that I cannot emphasize enough because it explains why so many people cycle through treatments without ever achieving lasting resolution. These three patterns don't exist in isolation. They are in constant communication, feeding on each other and amplifying each other in a self reinforcing cycle. Chi stagnation, that leads to blood stasis. When energy isn't flowing, when those body fluids aren't flowing correctly, then from emotional stress, toxic burden, self-infections, circulation suffers, man. Stagnant chi means stagnant blood. The tissue becomes hypoxic, no oxygen. Senescent cells begin to accumulate, blood stasis. The inflammatory cascade begins. Blood stasis creates phlegm-dampness. Oh, yes. When circulation is poor and inflammation is unchecked and chronic, the body's ability to clear metabolic waste deteriorates. It's not just because you're having another birthday, guys. It's these systems are breaking down and you have control over this. Now, lymphatic drainage slows, toxins that should be eliminated are instead stored in adipose tissue and bones. Gosh, what are some of the things that we see as we age? Can't lose weight, osteoarthritis, these things, they all line up. That dampness continues to build. The cellular trash removal system backs up. And phlegm dampness blocks chi circulation. All that accumulated waste creates congestion and heaviness throughout the entire body, further obstructing the flow of energy, further damaging the mitochondria, further disrupting the cellular communications that keep every system coordinated. The cycle completes. So, what you end up with in most patients with chronic illness is a body that has been running this loop for years. But honestly, just not even chronic illness, just a body that's living in our modern day environment. That stress creates energy blockage. That energy blockage is impaired circulation. The poor circulation allows the toxins to accumulate, and the toxic accumulation, well, further disrupts the energy flow. And at each revolution of the cycle, the biological age of the tissue advanced faster than the chronological age. And this is why treating one pattern in isolation so often leads to just temporary improvement, followed by relapse. And why you reduce inflammation, but the chi stagnation and the toxic burden driving it are really still there. You do a detox, but the blood stasis is preventing clearance and it's unchanged. You manage stress, but the metabolic dysfunction, well, has a life of its own and it continues. You continue to gain weight. The insight that changes everything in this really, though, is that you have to address all three patterns simultaneously, not just sequentially. And one can lead to the other, but you want to really address all of them. You want to bring the body back into complete balance that way. So simultaneously, we talk. And because they are interdependent and because the hallmarks of aging they drive are also interdependent. Segment 8. Let me make this concrete. I want to walk through a few major chronic conditions and show you how this pattern framework explains them in a way that a simple diagnosis never does. Autoimmune conditions, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Hashimoto's, they all have blood stasis as their primary driver. The chronic inflammation and tissue destruction are the core pattern, but almost always there's a significant chi stagnation component. Emotional stress, well, it's a well documented trigger for autoimmune flares. And stealth pathogens or toxic burden, they're driving the underlying energy obstruction. Phlegm-Dampness, toxic accumulation, and metabolic burden, it's typically tertiary but critical to address for lasting resolution and definitely for mental and cognitive function as you age, especially as you age. So, mental health disorders, depression, anxiety, ADHD, are primarily chi stagnation conditions. They also have a phlegm damp component to them as well. The nervous system and the neurotransmitter systems are obstructed. There's too much toxin also stored deeply in the brain that's interfering with the neurotransmitter function in the brain itself. So the secondary blood stasis can also show up as neuroinflammation causing as well. And that research is actually increasingly linking to treatment resistant depression. And then, yeah, again, phlegm dampness shows up as brain fog, cognitive dysfunction, that constant leaching of toxins that are stored deeply, like aluminum, heavy metal. They accumulate in the brain tissue. And that's what we know now that disrupts the exact cellular signaling pathways that are responsible for mood regulation and for memory. Neurological conditions, neurodegenerative conditions, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, MS, multiple sclerosis are primary blood stasis, chronic neuroinflammation, reduced cerebral blood flow, disrupted lymphatic clearance. That's how they show up. Secondary phlegm dampness, again, the encapsulation of accumulated toxins and proteins and cellular debris that accumulate from having those things present, and the body always driving cholesterol and formation and containment of those toxins in the brain. Well, it's what researchers now call the failure of the brain's waste disposal system. And chi stagnation underlies the nervous system dysfunction that's initiated through that cascade. Metabolic disorders, let's look at that one. Type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, they're primary phlegm dampness, but they cannot be fully resolved without addressing the chi stagnation that's driving stress, eating, and adrenal dysfunction and dysregulation, and the blood stasis that's driving vascular complications and microcirculatory dysfunction. And what's striking about this framework is not just that it explains each condition, it's that it actually reveals the shared architecture beneath seemingly unrelated diseases. So, an autoimmune patient, a diabetic patient, and a patient with early cognitive decline all have some combination of these things and these three patterns. So, they're not that far off, even though symptom wise they look completely different. The patterns are the same, guys, and the proportions might differ and the exact combo of them might differ to different degrees, but the specific expression is really that they're all involved that way. The tissue involved differs, the root is really the same. All right, so let's really bring this home now. Now, if there's one thing that I want you to carry out from this conversation, it's really this: your chronic symptoms are not random, they are not separate problems. They are not inevitable. And aging isn't either. They're a pattern and their patterns can be changed. So, the three foundational patterns, chi stagnation, blood stasis, and phlegm dampness, are not mystical concepts divorced from modern science. They are description of real, measurable physiological phenomena or states, really, that are disrupted: neurovascular flow, mitochondrial dysfunction, chronic circulatory impairment. These are all things that are resulting from inflammation and cellular senescence and metabolic and toxic accumulation and lymphatic congestion. And these same patterns through the 12 hallmarks of aging are the mechanisms by which chronic illness and premature biological aging are the same problem. They are two expressions of the same unresolved root. The reason so many people cycle through treatments without lasting resolution is that they keep treating symptoms and the downstream effects without addressing the upstream patterns that are creating them. And the reason so many people age faster than they should is really that these patterns have been silently accumulating and operating in the background for years without a framework that could actually see them. Now, the better question to ask really isn't what medication treats my diagnosis. The better question really is what underlying patterns are creating my symptoms and how are they connected? And what does my body need to resolve them at the root? And that question changes everything. Now, I'd love to know which of these three patterns resonates most with you and your experience right now. And are you living with the tension and the blockage of chi stagnation, or the inflammation and the pain of the blood stasis, or the heaviness and the fog and the metabolic sluggishness of phlegm dampness, or some of these combination of all three? Come find me and let me know. And thank you for being here. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for tuning into the Resiliency Method, the Truth About Healing podcast. If this episode spoke to you, follow, share, and leave us a review. Are you ready to go deeper? Book your discovery call now at drerikaonline.com/discovery and take your first step today.